if I look at Africa broadly, then yes, you are far within the technological frontier. Much of infrastructure is poorly developed, the urban system is poorly developed. So for much of Africa, I would say catching up, and starting with agriculture, where the yields are extraordinarily low, and the future looks somewhat not so promising in terms of climate change and so on. So for the rest of Africa, catching up is very important. But the question is, catching up where? And the way I see it is, catching up in agriculture is critical, really important to generate the surpluses, release the workers to go to the cities. But when it comes to the urban industrial system, there it's less clear that the linear path of East Asia is the appropriate path for the rest of Africa. I'm not now talking about South Africa, which is in some sense very much an outlier. So for the rest of Africa, can they go down the path of, let's say, Vietnam? That is, they develop a whole host of light manufacturing industries, hook on to global value chains, and export these to what were the traditional importers, Europe, the United States. And the way I now see it is that looks like a less promising path. I don't think that path will be available to most countries. And yesterday when we talked about it, the main reason as I see it is that manufacturing as a share of GDP is shrinking for 2 or 3 reasons. One reason is extremely high levels of productivity, which means that you can get very many fewer people to do a lot more. The second is that as a consequence, relative prices have gone down. So manufacturers are immensely cheaper relative to services. And the third reason is that China and other East and South Asian countries are now so well established as producers of manufacturers that the rest of the world, and particularly African countries, now are squeezed out. And whether that can change seems in the near term or in the medium term very unlikely. So catching up in manufacturing now has a completely different connotation to me than it would have had 10 and 15 years ago. So I'm focusing more on a mix of manufacturing and services of a tradable sort. Now, we're also thinking of it in an urban context. And again, when we discussed this yesterday, my view was that any successful city is not, in a sense, an island in itself. You have to import stuff, whether it's services or goods. No city is an island. You can't just be self-sufficient. Hence, every city that is a success has to be exporting something. Services, which you have to add value in some fashion. Exports are up. You can survive on the basis of rents from selling minerals, or transfers from the rest of the country, or capital inflows if you've got a whole diaspora outside. And you can survive on that. But that's just survival. And that's not a long-term sustainable situation. So what cities have to do in Africa is to create a system which is very different from what existed in Vietnam or elsewhere, or now exists there or in China, and to try and develop something else which is tradable, which, whether it sells to the rest of the country or sells abroad, but has to develop those capabilities, and they will not be a mirror image of what happened in Africa, in Asia. So we've got to think a little bit creatively of what the rest of Africa can do.